By the time the plague arrived, the world was already collapsing. The mid-6th century was not an age of strength or prosperity. It was an era of exhaustion. The climate disasters that began in 536 AD had weakened societies across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Harvests had failed. Famine had reduced populations. Trade networks barely functioned. Into this fragile world came something far worse. In the year 541 AD, reports began to spread of a strange and terrifying illness emerging from the eastern Mediterranean. It moved silently at first, carried along the same trade routes that once sustained civilization. Ships arrived in ports not only with grain and goods, but with death. The Eastern Roman Empire, ruled by Justinian I, stood at the center of this storm. Constantinople was the largest city in the world, a hub of commerce connecting Africa, Asia, and Europe. Its crowded streets, massive grain imports, and dense population made it uniquely vulnerable. No one understood what was coming. When the disease reached the capital, it struck with unprecedented force. People fell ill suddenly. High fevers, swelling in the groin and armpits, delirium, and rapid death followed. In some cases, victims died within days, in others, within hours. Contemporary observers were horrified. They had survived darkened skies. They had endured hunger. But this was different. This was invisible, unstoppable, and everywhere. The plague of Justinian had begun, and it would become one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. The people of the 6th century had no name for what was killing them. They did not know about bacteria. They did not understand infection or transmission. All they could see were the symptoms, sudden, violent, and terrifying. The illness often began with fever and exhaustion. Victims complained of headaches, nausea, and confusion. Within days, painful swellings appeared, usually in the groin, armpits, or neck. These swellings, later known as buboes, could grow to the size of an egg or larger. For many, death followed quickly. Some died within 2 or 3 days. Others lingered longer, drifting in and out of delirium. A small number survived, but survival offered no certainty. Many were left weakened, scarred, or permanently changed. The disease spread relentlessly. Homes became death traps. Families vanished within days. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. In Constantinople, observers reported thousands dying every day at the height of the outbreak. Normal life ceased. Markets closed. Fields were abandoned. Even basic city functions collapsed. Fear deepened the chaos. People avoided the sick. Friends fled one another. Clergy performed last rites in the streets. The sound of carts carrying the dead became constant. In some districts, bodies were stacked in towers or thrown into mass graves. No remedy worked. Prayers failed. Traditional medicine failed. Isolation came too late. The plague moved faster than human response, exploiting crowded cities and exhausted populations. The ancient world had faced famine, war, and disaster before, but never anything like this. The plague of Justinian did not remain confined to one city or one region. What made it so devastating was movement. The same trade routes that had connected the ancient world for centuries now carried the disease across continents. Grain shipments from Egypt fed Constantinople and transported infected rats and fleas. Merchant caravans carried goods across the Middle East, unknowingly spreading death along every road they traveled. Within a few years, the plague had reached nearly every corner of the Mediterranean world. It swept through Anatolia, the Balkans, Italy, Gaul, and the Iberian Peninsula. It moved south into North Africa and east into Persia. No empire, kingdom, or city remained untouched. Even remote rural areas eventually felt the impact as survivors fled cities, carrying the disease with them. The scale was unprecedented. Modern estimates suggest that between 25 and 50 million people may have died during the first outbreak, as much as half the population of some regions. In Constantinople alone, deaths at the peak may have reached tens of thousands per day. Entire communities vanished. Military units collapsed as soldiers died faster than they could be replaced. Farms were left untended. Tax systems failed as populations disappeared. Trade slowed, then stopped entirely. The plague did not strike once and fade. It returned in waves for nearly 2 centuries, reappearing every generation. Each outbreak further weakened societies already struggling to recover from famine and climate collapse. This was not merely a health crisis, it was a systemic failure of civilization itself. No empire was prepared for what the plague would do. The Eastern Roman Empire had entered the 6th century with ambition. Under Emperor Justinian I, Constantinople sought to reclaim lost Western territories, restore Roman law, and rebuild imperial power. These plans depended on money, manpower, and stability. The plague destroyed all three. As death swept through cities and countryside alike, tax revenues collapsed. Farmers died or fled, leaving fields unworked. Soldiers fell ill in barracks and on campaign. Recruitment became nearly impossible. Entire regiments ceased to exist. Justinian himself was infected. According to contemporary sources, the emperor narrowly survived, though his recovery did not reverse the damage. The state continued to function, but only barely. Military campaigns stalled. Defensive priorities replaced expansion. Resources once used for conquest were diverted simply to keep the empire alive. The Persian Empire fared no better. Long wars with Byzantium had already drained both states. The plague struck Persia repeatedly, weakening royal authority and hollowing out its population. Border regions became unstable, local power structures fractured. Across Europe, emerging kingdoms lacked the resilience to respond. Without centralized administration, outbreaks shattered communities with no possibility of organized recovery. Political authority weakened everywhere the disease spread. The plague did not cause empires to collapse overnight, but it permanently altered their trajectory. The ancient balance of power was broken, not by invasion, but by disease. The plague did more than kill. It changed how people lived. With populations collapsing, labor became scarce. Survivors found themselves in a world where land was abundant, but hands to work it were not. In some regions, wages rose as workers gained leverage once unimaginable in ancient societies. In others, economic life simply froze. Cities emptied. Neighborhoods that had once been crowded with merchants and craftsmen fell silent. Public buildings decayed. Roads and aqueducts were no longer maintained. In many places, urban life would not fully recover for centuries. Social bonds frayed. Fear reshaped human behavior. Traditional care for the sick broke down under the risk of infection. Families abandoned relatives. Burial customs were discarded as mass graves replaced individual rights. Trust eroded, not through malice, but survival. Religion filled the vacuum left by explanation. People turned to faith to understand suffering they could not control. Processions, prayers, and rituals multiplied. Some sought meaning, others sought blame. The plague intensified religious life across the Mediterranean, strengthening institutions that promised hope in an uncertain world. Psychologically, the impact was profound. Generations grew up expecting death as a constant presence. The sense of continuity that had defined the ancient world, the belief that tomorrow would resemble yesterday, was broken. The plague did not simply pass through society, it rewrote it.
In later centuries, pandemics would come and go. Populations would fall and then rebound. Economies would adapt. New social structures would emerge. But after the Plague of Justinian, recovery remained incomplete. The reason was timing. The ancient world entered the plague already weakened by climate collapse and famine. When disease struck, it did not interrupt growth, it erased what little stability remained. There was no surplus to rebuild from, no strong institutions left untouched. Repeated outbreaks made matters worse. The plague returned again and again for nearly 200 years. Each resurgence struck a population that had never fully recovered from the previous one. Children grew up in societies that never knew demographic stability. Skills, knowledge, and continuity were lost with every generation. Economic specialization disappeared. As trade declined, communities turned inward. Long-distance exchange, the lifeblood of ancient civilization, faded. Local self-sufficiency replaced interconnected economies. Complexity gave way to survival. Political authority weakened further. States struggled to collect taxes, maintain armies, or enforce law across shrinking populations. Power fragmented. Local leaders replaced imperial systems. The ancient administrative world dissolved slowly, almost unnoticed. This was not a sudden collapse, it was erosion. By the time the plague finally faded from history, the world it had entered no longer existed. What remained was not the ancient world, but the foundations of medieval society.
For centuries, the Plague of Justinian was remembered only through fragmented texts and distant echoes of suffering. It was not until modern science began to examine ancient remains that the true nature of the disease became clear. DNA analysis of skeletal remains has confirmed that the plague was caused by Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium responsible for the Black Death of the 14th century. This discovery transformed historical understanding. The 6th century pandemic was not a mystery illness. It was the first recorded outbreak of a disease that would haunt humanity for over 1,000 years. Modern epidemiology has also revealed why the plague was so devastating. Dense urban centers, global trade routes, and weakened populations created ideal conditions for its spread. Once established, the disease exploited every connection civilization had built. The lessons are uncomfortable. Advanced societies are not immune to collapse. Complexity creates strength, but also vulnerability. When multiple systems fail at once, recovery becomes uncertain. The Plague of Justinian reminds us that history's greatest turning points are often silent. There was no single battle, no final collapse, no moment the ancient world realized it was ending. It simply faded. Civilizations do not always fall. Sometimes they weaken until they are no longer the same. And long after the plague disappeared, its consequences remained, shaping the world that followed. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it remembers.